Good evening. Thank you very much for tuning in to the Lessons of Vietnam show. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the United States involvement in the Vietnam War by dates. This is our third installment of this of the dates and so forth. We will finish it up tonight. As you're looking at your screen there, you'll see the Lessons of Vietnam show as we get to it. I'm your host, Bill Dixon, Vietnam 6768. We're broadcast through the courtesy of Nissan Communications, their world headquarters here in Raleigh, right next to Cary. We invite you to be part of the show if you'd like. You can call in at 919-518-9773, or even better, come in on Skype, and that's Computers 2K Voice. And take part in the show, ask questions, make comments, or whatever else you want to do as long as it's about Vietnam. We're always looking for a new guest. If you were a war protester, or you were a RIMP, whatever it was that you were involved in some way with Vietnam, well, we want to hear from you because we want to cover all of the things about the Vietnam War. So as you're out there, tell all your friends about us and so forth. Another good thing to tell all your friends and so forth out there, if you are a veteran or you know a veteran that is having a struggle, especially at this time of year, with Thanksgiving coming up, Christmas and so forth. It can be a hard time for a lot of veterans. Reach out to them and have them to dial the 1-800-273-8255 number. And there's someone there, let's see, it says free support is confidential, available every day, 24/7. And it serves all veterans, service members, National Guard and Reserve, and their family members and friends. So reach out and let's see if we can't get rid of these 22 a day that everybody's talking about. So let's get on into the show here as we go backtrack a little bit from what we did last time. May 14th, 1970, during a protest against the Cambodian invasion fueled by civil rights in Kent State, 2 students were killed by police. Now, if you remember that famous picture of the young lady kneeling down, she was not a student there. She was actually a runaway, and there's an interesting article about how that picture taken and completely changed her life, and as far as she was concerned, ruined it. But it was a tragic situation. They were killed by National Guard people there. Let's see, June 3rd, 1970, North Vietnam begins an invasion into Cambodia. U.S. planes counterattack with airstrikes. On June 3rd, 1970, U.S. stopped spraying its defoliant Agent Orange, Blue, White, Pink, and Black, and the defoliants and so forth. It was originally started as a result as a request from the Prime Minister of South Vietnam, President Diem. June 24th, 1970, the United Senate repeals the 1964 Gulf of Tonkin resolution that got us the U.S. in the Vietnam conflict. So in 1970, repealed it. Now, I'm not certain exactly what exactly that's supposed to mean. We were already there. We're in the war, but they repealed it. Well, maybe some of y'all can call in and tell me what that means, because they repealed it, but it didn't make any difference because we're already there in the war. Anyway, moving along. June 30th, 1970, U.S. combat troops withdraw from Cambodia. Well, let's put it this way. The troops we sent in from Vietnam withdrew from Cambodia. The troops we sent to Cambodia directly, they didn't withdraw. September 5th, 1970, U.S. offensive of the war begins. The last official U.S. offensive of the war begins. So in 1970, we were going into Vietnamization. We were starting to back down a little bit, and we were going to start being more of the advisors. October 7th, 1970, President Nixon approaches North Vietnam with a proposal, a standstill ceasefire. All troops on both sides were to stop firing at each other and stand in place until a formal ceasefire could be accomplished. There was no response from North Vietnam. Of course, it was about 5 years later before we ever got around to having an agreement. November 20th, 1970, U.S. troops in Vietnam drops to 334,600. December 10th, 1970, President Nixon warns North Vietnam that there would be more bombing raids on North Vietnam if their attacks continued in South Vietnam. And of course, North Vietnam being who they were, they just decided to get out and get right on going doing what they were doing. December 22nd, 1970. This is an important event of the rest of the war. So I'm going to read it slow so you can get it real close. Cooper Church Amendment, which would have restricted President Nixon's authority to wage war in Cambodia without the consent of Congress. The amendment passed in the Senate, but the House rejected it. The amendment passed in a revised form in 1971. However, provisions prohibiting air combat activity were stripped out following the U.S. bombing campaign in Cambodia to continue, allowing the bombing in Cambodia to commence. This was the start of the Case Church Amendment. We're going to talk about a little bit farther down. On January 4th, 1971, in his speech, President Nixon announced, "The end is in sight." I'm not certain whose end he was saying was in sight, but the end was in sight. On January 9th, 1971, 17,000 South Vietnamese troops backed by U.S. air support began Operation Lam Som 719 in an attempt to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos. Another country heard from. The South Vietnamese troops did not perform as well as expected, but President Nixon declared the operation in Vietnamization as a success. On March 1st, 1971, a bomb exploded in the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., causing an estimated $300,000 in damage, but hurting no one. A group calling itself the Weather Underground claimed credit for the bombing, which was done in protest of the ongoing U.S. supported Laos invasion. Okay, we were working with the Laotians, we were working with the Cambodians to help stop the Ho Chi Minh Trail, plus to stop communism there, but little is known about those wars. We're going to talk about those in another show. March 10th, 1971, China promises North Vietnam its total support if the U.S. and communist in the U.S. and Communist War. What that was saying was, hey, if they attack you in North Vietnam, we'll step in, kind of like in Korea when the Chinese stepped in. Up until then, it just been kind of a threat. March 31st, 1971, half of an opinion poll felt the United States-South Vietnamese war against North Vietnam was morally wrong. Okay, that was really created a lot by the protesters. On April 24th, 1971, in Washington, about 200,000 anti-war protesters demonstrated. On April 29th, 1971, the 450,000 American dies in Vietnam War. That's not 450,000 died, that's the 450,000th American dies in Vietnam. Okay. There's 58,000 on the wall. This is the 45,000. You can figure out what I'm trying to say. On March 3rd through the 5th, 12,000 protesters arrested in Washington. June 13th, 1971, President Nixon is infuriated by the New York Times printing of the Pentagon Papers by Daniel Ellsberg, who got the papers. The documents are a secret Department of Defense document disclosing the handling of the Vietnam War. And the last thing they wanted to know was anybody to know how they handled the Vietnam War. So that's where the Pentagon Papers coming out. June 15th, 1971, taking legal action, President Nixon attempted to stop the New York Times from publishing more of the Pentagon Papers. June 8th, 1971, the Washington Post starts running the Pentagon Papers. So the suit against New York Times didn't get very far. Not June 22nd, can't read tonight, 1971, the U.S. Supreme Court passes a non-binding resolution to pull all U.S. troops out of Vietnam by year's end. So the Supreme Court decided that we should move everybody out. I'm not certain what authority they had, but basically they didn't have any. They just voiced their opinion. June 25th, 1971, last of the U.S. Marine ground units leave Vietnam. Okay, supposedly they were the first to go in, but we had advisors there a long time, but they left. That is Daniel Ellsberg, you see on the cover of the magazine, the Time magazine there, with Pentagon Papers, says classified documents stolen from the Pentagon, exposed government knowledge that war would cost more lives than the public was being told. Public told war was ending, but escalation was happening. Government censorship the information, but Supreme Court says no. Public distrust of government. That, there was a part of some mistrust of the government before, but with the Vietnam War, it brought out a lot of distrust from the government. On June 28, 1971, the whistleblower of the Pentagon Papers surrendered. The whistleblower. That kind of rings true today, doesn't it? July 1st, but at least we knew who he was. July 1st, 1971, another 6,000 U.S. troops leave South Vietnam. On July 16, 1971, in an effort to put pressure on North Vietnam, President Nixon announces he would be going to China in 1972. To play ping pong. To play ping pong along with Forrest Gump, yeah. Folks, and the war is still going on, okay? The White House Plumbers. This was a big event. After the release of the Pentagon Papers, the White House created a unit to ensure internal security. They were going to make sure that nobody got any more sneaky papers out. This unit was called the Plumbers because they were put in charge of stopping information leaks. You see, the first one there is Howard Hunt, James McCord, G. Gordon Liddy. He's a tough-looking guy, and he was, and Chuck Colson. July 17, 1971, President Nixon establishes the White House Plumbers unit to investigate, plug any leaks like those of the Pentagon Papers. Chuck Colson puts together a list of 200 prominent American citizens that were considered anti-Nixon. In other words, he made out the first enemies list, kind of like some other politicians have done in the last few years, put their enemies list out. But those were people who had to be watched with the FBI and so forth. CIA had the secret war in Laos. August 2nd, 1971, the CIA admits that it is sponsoring 30,000 irregulars in Laos. See what I mean about the secret war going on in Laos at the time? There were ethnic hill people known as Hmongs. The CIA operations from 1961 to 1975 became known as the Secret War beneath because, unlike in Vietnam, America's military involvement in Laos was covert. Instead of sending American ground troops to prevent a communist takeover here, the CIA hired tens of thousands of mercenaries, most of whom were Hmong, a hill-dwelling ethnic people. So that was the war going on in Laos, and it was kind of like the war going on in Cambodia. Now, on August 18, 1971, Australia and New Zealand make the announcement they are withdrawing their troops from Vietnam. That was some of our allies pulling out. On October 3rd, 1971, Nguyen Van Thu is reelected president of South Vietnam. Kind of patted him on the back and said they liked the way he was doing things. October 9th, 1971, members of the 1st Cavalry refused to go out on a mission. This was another big thing. Up until the 70s, drug use and racial problems were somewhat of a minimum, but in the 70s, it got to be a problem over there because we were pulling out and nobody wanted to be the last person went out. And there was an order sent out for members of the 1st Cavalry to go out on a patrol. People involved said, why? It don't mean nothing. We're not going to gain anything, so we're not going to go out. So they refused to go out. Morale, racism, and discipline was beginning to decline with U.S. troops. No one wanted to be the last one to die in Vietnam as the United States was already preparing to leave. So they got a little bit more picky when it come to going out with some units, okay? And that is something that doesn't happen often in the military. It could be grounds for getting shot. October 31st, 1971, South Vietnamese releases 3,000 Viet Cong prisoners of the war. There are some of the prisoners being released. December 17th, 1971, the number of U.S. troops drops to 156,800 in Vietnam. I like that. Drops to 156,000. That's still a lot of Americans there. On January 25th, 1972, Nixon reveals that Kissinger has been secretly negotiating with North Vietnam that Nixon, has proposed an 8-point peace plan. North Vietnam rejects the plan. least they told him he rejected this time. They hadn't even been answering him. So I have a question there, but I'm going to ask it a little bit later. February 21st through the 28th in 1972, North Vietnam feels threatened as President Nixon visits China and has a meeting with Mao Zedong and Prime Minister Zhou Enlai. North Vietnam is concerned with improved China and U.S. relations. See, China is paying for 90-some% of all the of North Vietnam's expenses, and now Nixon's over there buddying with the Chinese. So they're saying, well, maybe he's got a better deal with the Chinese than we got with the Chinese. So we need to be concerned. March 10th, 1972, the 101st Airborne Division withdraws from Vietnam. We're getting down to the nitty-gritty now, folks. March 23rd, the U.S. boycotts the Paris peace talks because President Nixon felt the North Vietnamese were not negotiating seriously. I mean, they'd argue about the size of their table, who sit where, just about anything. They wanted the Viet Cong involved. They didn't want the South Vietnamese involved. Anything they could come up to just kind of slow things down. They thought they'd get the Americans frustrated enough to quit fighting the war. Oh, it worked, didn't it? Okay, let's see what else is going on. The Eastern Offensive, 1972. Now, I've done a couple of shows on this. Bat 21 went on that. Rick Riscorder was involved in a battle at the beginning with this, but the man whose name is just totally went away from me. Anyway, Eastern Offensive, 1972. The American advisor got up one morning and looked out, and there was about 600 Russian tanks on the other side of the river from Dong Ha. American advisor is still with the ARVN units. March 30th, 1972, North Vietnamese starts its Eastern Offensive. This was an all-out effort to take over South Vietnam. They decided to come on in and try it, and it didn't work. But that is actually two books was out, Volume 1 and Volume 2. About the DMZ, right at Dong Ha and through that area, and just north of Quezon a little bit. So, okay. On April 4th, 1972, Operation Linebacker is authorized by President Nixon. It started a massive bombing campaign. You remember Rolling Thunder? Well, they ended Rolling Thunder. It really wasn't working. But they started this Operation Linebacker with massive bombing campaign. One of the aspects was to cut all rail and land supplies between China and North Vietnam. Linebacker saw 7th Air Force and Task Force 77 conduct 414 sorties against enemy targets. Now, this was right on the China North Vietnam border, just about. President Nixon authorized the bombing of Hanoi and Haiphong Harbor in April 15, 1972. This brings new protests in the United States because it says we're expanding the war. We wouldn't bomb those a whole lot to start with, but because we were afraid we might bomb a Chinese or a Russian ship that was in the harbor unloading supplies. By the way, the phone number is 919-518-9773. If you'd like to call in and make a comment, be part of the show or whatever. On April 27, 1972, the Paris peace talks resumed. Some credit with Operation Linebacker and the bombing of Hanoi and Haiphong Harbor. Even though they it brought them back to the peace table, but there was so much protest back in the United States about the bombing and so forth. Even though it brought them back to the peace table, it did give them the what they needed to hang in and negotiate more. Even though they were afraid of being bombed some more, they just knew that the peace activists in the United States was going to support them. April 30th, 1972, U.S. troops count is down to 69,000 in Vietnam. Okay, just a little bit more than what's on the wall in 1972. On May 8, 1972, President Nixon announces that he is authorizing the mining of Haiphong Harbor and intensifying the bombing of North Vietnam. In other words, the peace talks started in April were just kind of going on and on and on. So he wanted to give them a little bit more incentive. So he announced the bombing again. On June 17th and 19th, 1972, the White House plumbers are arrested inside the office of the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate Hotel and Complex in Washington. This is the beginning of a huge scandal. Now, see, all this ties back into the Vietnam War. Because as we just said, even though Americans were coming home, the war's still going on and Americans are still dying. But the White House plumbers who were going to stop the leak, they broke into the Democratic National Headquarters at the Watergate Hotel, which is a huge hotel and office complex, beautiful place. If you have to go see it sometimes, it is expensive. On June 30th, 1972, General Creighton Abrams is replaced by General Frederick Wayan as MACV commander. General Abrams becomes Chief of Staff of the United States Army, which is the same job that Westmoreland took over when he came home. And July 13th, 1972, the Paris peace talks resumed. In other words, the new bombing kind of got him attention again. On July 14th, 1972, the Democrats select a strong critic of the Vietnam War. Senator George McGovern is their presidential nominee. Okay? Kind of like we got a presidential election coming up, but they didn't have 15 to 20 people running. On July 18th, another bread letter day, 1972, Hanoi Jane wins her nickname. Jane Fonda visits Hanoi and broadcasts anti-war messages and visits with the communist soldiers. To the U.S. horror, Jane Fonda encourages the communist troops to fight American imperialists and sang anti-war songs with them. And there she is in her famous picture, sitting on an anti-aircraft gun in Hanoi, waiting for the blonde-haired, blue-eyed murderers, which was the Americans that she was waiting for. And she's apologized for having that picture taken, but I don't think that her apology is really doing a whole lot of good for the people who were fighting the war at that time or who were POWs. Okay. Yes. August 1st, 1972, Henry Kissinger meets with North Vietnamese negotiator Le Duc Tho in Paris. See, by this time, Le Duc Tho had already taken over from Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was just kind of the symbolic leader. On August 23rd, 1972, Richard Nixon accepts the Republican nomination for president. Now, let me go back up here and read something. This is Henry Kissinger, who's directing the war. Let me read to you a comment he made. Military men are just dumb, stupid animals to be used as pawns in foreign policy. Henry Kissinger, quote. This is the man that's negotiating our peace and is running the war with our American soldiers all over in Vietnam, trying to fight to help the South Vietnamese. And he makes that comment. Illegals, we do immediately. Illegal, we do immediately. Unconstitutional, it takes a little bit longer. Was another thing. It was kind of like breaking into Watergate Hotel. Okay. October 4th, 1972, South Vietnam's President Thu states his opposition to the draft of the ceasefire agreement between Kissinger and Le Duc Tho. During a meeting with Henry Kissinger and his assistant, Alexander Haig, who, don't worry about a thing, I've got everything in control. Alexander Haig. Now, if you remember a while ago, Kissinger and Le Duc Tho met. But the people who are fighting the war is North Vietnam and South Vietnam. North Vietnam and the United States met to fight, talk about a peace talk, but the people who are actually fighting the country that's fighting, they got left out. Would that give him a reason to have an opposition to the ceasefire agreement? I throw in a little bit of a personal comment there. I'm sorry, but it's just more than I can handle. Sometimes I'll go along, but I want you to think about some things as we go. But if you don't like my comments, just don't even pay attention to them. But I think sometimes I just have to kind of let you know how things really worked. October 8th, 1972. This is the question to ponder by your host, which is me. Wasn't a war between North and South Vietnam. I just did that a little bit. Why was South Vietnam not invited to the peace talks between Kissinger and Le Duc Tho? Well, I'm going to tell you a little bit longer as we go along why they were not invited. Because they were getting sold out. But Henry Kissinger and Le Duc Tho break the stalemate with a compromise that the United States agreed to allow North Vietnamese units already in South Vietnam to stay in South Vietnam, and North Vietnam would allow the continued existence of the Thu regime. Another question was, what was to happen after through its term of office. Now, they're going to say, as long as you're in office, that we can, we're going to grandfather you in, and as long as you're in office, that you're okay. But when you're out of office, well, it's Katie bar the doors open to anybody. And by the way, we don't have to withdraw from your country. We're going to keep troops down there just so that when you leave office, that we can step in. Why would he not get upset about accepting? We're going to leave the bad guys in your country. What are they going to be doing during that period of time? And that we're going to let you run out your term. What kind of ego would people have to decide that somebody can run out of his term, but after that it was open to anything? So that was a good question to come up with. October 23rd, 1972, Kissinger meets in Saigon with South Vietnamese President Thu. They discussed a peace proposal. But that was an interesting conversation. President Thu rejects the condition that North Vietnamese troops could remain in South Vietnam. Meanwhile, Radio Hanoi broadcasts agreement details to put pressure on Henry Kissinger. In other words, whatever he told President Thu in South Vietnam was all of it, because if he left anything out or told a lie, then President Thu knew about it, because Hanoi broadcast it out and told everybody about the secrets. October 24th, 1972, South Vietnamese President Thu publicly denounces Kissinger and Le Duc Thou's peace plans. Okay? He came out and said, no way, hell no, no way. Okay? Now, the war's still going on. Do you feel like there's a sellout here? October 26, 1972, with just a week before the U.S. presidential election, North Vietnam accused the U.S. of attempting to sabotage the peace agreement. Henry Kissinger holds a press conference and declares, "We believe that peace is at hand. We believe that an agreement is in sight." This is what Kissinger says about the peace agreement, which is basically a peace agreement between the United States and North Vietnam. November 9th, 1972, Richard Nixon is reelected president of the United States in a landslide. And he's holding up his peace fingers right there, and he says, later he says, does that and says he won a crook. But anyway, November 14th, 1972, President Nixon pledges to South Vietnam's President Thu that the United States would take swift and retaliatory action if North Vietnam violated the proposed peace treaty. Now, I want to read that to you again, because remember, we're leaving the North Vietnamese in the places like Dong Ha, where they're already there, and wherever else they would happen to be. But we're going to come in and we're going to come back and fight the North Vietnamese, just like we were before, if they do anything they shouldn't be doing. And we'll keep right on moving along now. I just wanted you to remember that part as we move along. And the war goes on. The Americans are still dying. November 20th, 1972, Henry Kissinger resumes his talk with Le Duc Thau and submits the 69 amendments to their agreement demanded by South Vietnamese President Thu. Thu says, there ain't no way in hell we're going to agree to the peace talks unless I get my 69 agreements done. December 13th, 1972, the peace talks stall as of South Vietnamese 69 amendments. In other words, North Vietnam says, no, we're not going to go along with those. We're going to go with the agreement we originally had, where we're already halfway taking over the country to start with. December 18th, 1972, with no response from North Vietnam after President Nixon's demands to resume talk, Nixon orders Operation Linebacker 2. It is a massive bombing campaign to encourage North Vietnam to back to the negotiating tables. If you remember, that Linebacker 1 got them there to start with, or after a while, and now we're going to go try it again. But again, back in the United States, there was all kinds of protests. On December 26th, 1972, North Vietnam, I don't know where the word veteran came in. We'll just leave that, forget you didn't see that. It's like when the trials, jury, disregard that. So jury out there, disregard the word veteran. North Vietnam agrees to resume the peace talks within 5 days of the end of the bombing. December 29th, 1972, Operation Linebacker comes to an end. And you see a little bit of Hanoi there. On January 8th, 1973, Kissinger and Lee Duc meet in Paris and the talks begin again. This time, all issues are resolved enough to have an agreement by the next day. South Vietnam was not present and was forced to accept the agreement. South Vietnam was not present and was forced to accept the agreement. I wonder how many things of the 69 amendments he wanted done. South Vietnamese President Thu calls it tantamount to surrender. In other words, he wasn't too happy about it. Vietnam War is reached. Ceasefire began Saturday. POWs to be freed in 60 days. January 23rd, 1973, President Nixon announces that there had been an agreement reached and that will end the war and bring peace with honor. Folks, my own opinion, we just sold out the Vietnamese people, the Vietnamese government, and we're saying we're giving them a peace with honor. We just left the North Viet. We just kind of get the North Vietnamese saying you can have it, but you got to wait till we all get out. However, the agreement was little more than a face-saving gesture by the United States government. Even before the last American troops departed on March 29th, 1973, the communists violated the ceasefire and by early 1974, full-scale war had resumed. Now, we had a peace agreement that says that we're going to come back and help you if they break the peace agreement. Remember that we talked about a while ago? Okay, let's move on and we'll discuss that a little bit more as we go. On January 27th, 1973, the peace accords are signed by U.S., North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong, any direct U.S. military involvement in the Vietnam War. There they are signing it. Its key provision included a ceasefire throughout Vietnam, the withdrawal of U.S. forces, the release of prisoners of war, and the reunification of North and South Vietnam through peaceful means. The peaceful means we left a lot of the communist troops in South Vietnam. The South Vietnamese government was to remain in place until new elections were held, and North Vietnam forces in the South were not to advance further nor be reinforced. You got to stay right where you are. Okay. January 27, 1973, the Secretary of Defense makes the announcement the draft had ended. No more Uncle Sam pointing his finger and says, I want you to go to the recruiting station. January 27, 1973, Lieutenant Colonel William Knoll became the last American to be killed in Vietnam. He was from Michigan. Okay. Now, the U.S. Navy, on February 6, 1973, the U.S. Navy begins Operation Insweep. Remember those mines that went into Haiphong Harbor around Hanoi and were laying out? Now they got to go back and get them out. So they're back out there blowing them up, as you can see in the picture there. On February 12, 1973, Operation Homecoming begins as 591 U.S. prisoners of war released from Vietnam. And there they are on an airplane coming home. The first group, they were sent out in different groups. A plane load, and another plane load would come in. So now we're getting rid of the mines we put in the harbor for the North Vietnamese. We're fixing them up for them. So more Americans might die getting their bombs out, but that's okay because we're just Americans, according to Kissinger and North Vietnam. So I actually talked to a guy this weekend that was there doing that thing. Now, this is March 29, 1973. The last remaining troops leave Vietnam, and MACV, Military Assistance Command Vietnam, is deactivated. And right there happens to be Long Binh Post, which is where MACV headquarters was, about 20 miles from Saigon. It's actually where I was when I was there at Long Binh, and you can see them folding up the American flag and coming home. Approximately 7,000 Americans, mostly civilian employees of the Department of Defense, remained. Most of the Saigon and nearby areas is where they were. They were to support South Vietnam in defending itself from the north. A lot of those were CIA and office workers and so forth for the Defense Department. So those 7,000 were going to keep. I don't remember because we had about 500,000 soldiers there, and we couldn't keep the communists from coming down. And now 7,000 are going to do it. Okay. On April 1st, 1973, Captain Robert White is the last known American POW was released, an OV-1 pilot with the 1st Aviation Brigade in South Vietnam from October of 1969 until he was forced to eject from his stricken aircraft over South Vietnam, was taken as a prisoner of war on November 15th, 1969. Now, the OV-1 pilot is basically like a little Cessna airplane. His job was to fly low and look for the bad guys. And when you fly low, the bad guys have a tendency to shoot you. After spending 1,234 days in captivity, Captain White became the last American prisoner of war released during Operation Homecoming on April 1st, 1973. Now, he didn't come on because he was, from what I understand, he was not Hanoi, where the others were. He was kept in the tiger cages in the jungles of South Vietnam as a prisoner of war. The terrible place. Both of them were terrible, but he was in the tiger cages out in the jungle. April 2nd, 1973, Nixon and South Vietnamese President Thu meet in California, where Nixon again gives his secret pledge to respond militarily if North Vietnam breaks the peace accord. We had another special meeting April 2nd, the day after we all come home, saying that, almost 1970, but we just said that we're going to come back and help you out. Okay.
Should have done it on April 1st.
Yeah. April Fool's Day. Yeah. Okay. April 17th, Operation Insweep. The demining of Haiphong Harbor is suspended due to North Vietnam not abiding by the Paris Agreement, but were restarted April 18th, 1973. And you see that's where they're getting things. And then April 30th, 1973, Nixon aides H.R. Haldeman, John Dean, and as I call that in the names, left to right, you can see there, the guy with the glasses is John Dean. He became famous later. John Ehrlichman and Richard Kleindienst, I can't remember how you pronounce his name, Kleindienst, resigned as a result of the involvement with the Watergate scandal. Okay. In other words, the plumbers who broke into Watergate for Democratic headquarters it's starting to create a problem with Mr. Nixon or President Nixon. Okay. June 19, 1973. This is the camel this is a straw that broke the camel's back. Listen, okay. This is the one that really took us away from helping South Vietnam. June 19th, 1973. We had the Cooper Church Amendment. Now we have the Case Church Amendment, was legislated attached to the bill funding the United States State Department. In other words, unless you're going to kill the State Department funding, we had to pass it. It was approved by the U.S. Congress in June 1973 that prohibits further U.S. military activity in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia unless a president secured congressional approval in advance. Remember those promises a while ago that Nixon just made? Well, they just threw those out the window. Of course, if you're not president, you can't send them over there anyway. What we're basically saying right there, that, hey, it was nice of you, South Vietnam. We enjoyed it. We fought for you, but now you're totally on your own. We can't do nothing. This ended direct U.S. military involvement in the Vietnam War. Although the U.S. continued to provide military equipment and economic support to the South Vietnamese government, only for a short period of time left. It is named for its principal co-sponsors, Senator Clifford P. Chase and Frank Church. The amendment was defeated at 48-42 in the U.S. Senate in August 1972, but revived after the 1972 election. It was reintroduced on January 26, 1973, and approved by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on May 13th. Okay. Congress just threw South Vietnam to the wolves. When it became apparent that the amendment would pass, President Nixon and Secretary of State Kissinger lobbied frantically to have the deadline extended. However, under pressure from the extreme scrutiny of Watergate, Republicans relented on support for Vietnam, and the amendment passed the United States Congress in June 1973 by a margin of 325 to 86, and in the House 73 to 16 in the Senate. Both of these margins for the amendment's passage was greater than the two-thirds majority required to override a presidential veto, and Nixon signed it on July 1st, 1973. Although U.S. forces had been withdrawn from South Vietnam earlier pursuant to the Paris Peace Accords, air support and monetary support for Southeast Asia continued until August 15, 1973, the deadline set by the amendment. In other words, after August 15, 1973, nothing, a Band-Aid, a bottle of Mercurochrome. Those of you who are old enough to remember what that is, could go over there. We couldn't even fly a plane over in that area. Nothing. The South Vietnamese people that we promised we're going to go over and help are now on their own, and we left the communists in their country. Stop. Host notes. All support of any kind to South Vietnam stopped. We told our ally, you are on your own from now on. We will not help you in any way. What if we had told France or Great Britain that in World War II or South Korea that the United States Congress lost to Vietnam, that, in other words, what if we told South Korea going, hey, you're on your own now. We can't do nothing for you. What if we told Great Britain or France, hey, you're on your own. We might all be speaking German or whatever, or maybe even Korean. The United States Congress lost the Vietnam War with the passing of the Case Church Amendment. They deserted an ally. That was a little editorial there on my part, but please let me know if you can see it another way. I don't know how to can be any other way. This did not stop China, Cuba, or Russia from supplying support and supplies to North Vietnam. In other words, we walked off and left South Vietnam, but China, Cuba, or Russia and other communist countries continued. In fact, they even stepped up their support for North Vietnam. Now, the war is still going on with South Vietnam fighting. Dean alleges Nixon knew of cover-up plan. It's kind of like history's repeating itself, isn't it? June 25th, 1973, former White House counsel John Dean testifies to the Special Senate Committee that President Nixon tried to cover up the Watergate break-in. It gets worse. See, now Nixon's so busy trying to take care of his own butt, he ain't got time to worry about South Vietnam. July 13th, 1973, a former Nixon aide, Alexander Butterfield, discloses the existence of taped conversations that would establish Nixon's knowledge of the Watergate break-in. And Nixon's secretary lost, what was it, 17 minutes of some tape. She lost about 17 minutes of that tape. She accidentally erased it. Kind of like someone else that I know was in public office a couple of years back. Erased a lot of emails and so forth, but that's a different story. July 16th, 1973, United States Senate Armed Forces Committee begins hearings into the secret bombings of Cambodia between 1969 and 1970. Well, they weren't exactly secret by then, were they? Okay. This is the area of bombing that was done in Cambodia. As you can see, a lot of bombing. The United States dropped 2,756,941 tons of bombs and 230,516 sorties in Cambodia. July 17, 1973, the Armed Forces Committee investigated the secret bombings of Cambodia, angers many in Congress, and is a catalyst for the first call impeachment of President Nixon. So they're going to impeach him for the bombing of Cambodia. August 14, 1973, is a requirement of the Case Church Amendment. The bombing of Cambodia ends. October 10, 1973, amid allegations of cheating on his taxes and payoffs, Vice President Spiro Agnew resigns, and Congressman Gerald Ford is tapped as the new vice president. That, as you can see, is Vice President Spiro Agnew, and then the new vice president is Gerald Ford. On Time magazine, the push to impeach November 7th, 1973, the War Powers Act was passed by Congress, requiring the president to obtain the support of Congress within 90 days of sending U.S. troops abroad. On May 9th, 1974, impeachment proceedings against Nixon begins. Let's see, May. Okay, now we're in November. Okay. July 24th, 1974, the United States Supreme Court recommends impeaching Nixon on 3 accounts. As we already said, they don't have a whole lot to say about it, but they also said to end the war a long time ago. July 30th, 1974, the House Judiciary Committee recommends impeaching Nixon on 3 accounts. April 9th, 1974, Richard M. Nixon resigns due to the Watergate scandal. What happened to Cambodian bombings? Vice President Gerald Ford becomes president. And Gerald Ford come in and says, urges a time of healing. September 8th, 1974, President Gerald Ford signs the Proclamation 4311, granting a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon for all offenses against the United States, which he has committed or may not have committed or taken part in during the period from January 20th, 1969 to August 9th, 1974. Now you know why he resigned, because so it was agreement so he can get pardoned. September 16th, 1974, Gerald Ford announces a clemency program for draft dodgers and deserters. Let me read that to you again out there, fellow veterans and friends of veterans. September 6, 1974, Gerald Ford announces a clemency program for draft dodgers and deserters. Okay. On September 30th, 1974, Congress only appropriates $700 million for South Vietnam. Such a drastic reduction in support leaves the Army of the Republic of Vietnam and the economy in great disarray. On October 24th, 1974, the North Vietnamese Communists decided to launch an invasion into South Vietnam. They just did a few of them to start with, just little things, just to see how the United States would act, and they would come in and do something. And history will tell you the rest. December 13, 1974, the North Vietnamese violate the Paris Peace Treaty by attacking Phuc Long province in South Vietnam. The U.S. makes a diplomatic protest, but nothing more as a result of the Case-Church Amendment. They probably told North Vietnam, well, bless your heart. If you're down in the South, you know what that means. December 18, 1974, the North Vietnamese, after observing the U.S. United States in action after the attack at Phuc Long, decided to plan for a final victory. January 14th, 1975, Secretary of Defense Sheesh is in a testimony before Congress tells the United States it's not living up to its earlier promise to South Vietnam of severe retaliatory action in the event the North Vietnamese violated the Paris Peace Accords. I'm glad somebody brought it up. On March 1st, 1975, North Vietnamese launched their final offensive into South Vietnam and attacked into the Central Highlands. On March 13th, 1975, South Vietnamese President Thu meets his commanders at Cam Ranh Bay, or Cam Ranh was the place, Cam Ranh Bay was the base there, and orders all troops to retreat to the coastal town of Tuy Hoa to defend Saigon and southern Vietnam. The withdrawal causes widespread panic and massive refugee escaping. The soldiers were scared to death when they were starting to pull back. The Vietnamese people were just trying their best to get out. As you can see, the soldiers are not exactly an orderly retreat there. Okay. March 25th, South Vietnamese troops flee the imperial city of Hue and leave it to North Vietnam. They don't even have a battle there. They just leave. That was way after Tet. You can see kind of where that was the imperial city there. The walls, some of those walls about 12 foot thick. But they just didn't even bother a fight for it. They just gave it up and headed south. On March 29th, North Vietnam's troops captured the city of Da Nang without a fight. As you can see, the refugees are getting on the buses and so forth. They got about as many people and things on top of the bus that they have in the bus. But they're trying to leave the northern part of South Vietnam, Da Nang, and so forth, heading closer to Saigon because that's where all the troops are done. April 9th, 1975, North Vietnamese Army close into Swan Lock, located 37 miles from Saigon. The South Vietnamese 18th Division puts up a stiff defense. But see, they don't have all the equipment that the North Vietnam have with the tanks and so forth because we quit funding them. April 10th, 1975, President Gerald Ford goes on TV and makes an emotional plea for $722 million in emergency aid to South Vietnam. Not only did Congress not respond, some members got up and left during his speech. Just got up right in the middle of his speech and left. April 12th, 1975, Operation Eagle Pool begins the evacuation of U.S. and Allied forces from Phnom Penh in Cambodia. In other words, it was pretty much seen that South Vietnamese was going to fall, so we started pulling our people out of Cambodia, which is interesting since we didn't have people in Cambodia, according to the government. April 17, 1975, Lon Nol's forces, which was forces surrendered to the Cambodian Communist Khmer Rouge, and Pol Pot begins an unprecedented reign of killing terror. And if you've ever seen the movie or read the book, The Killing Fields, you will see where Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge came in and what happened in that story. I would highly recommend you see the movie, or even better, read the book. Okay. April 20th, 1975, U.S. Ambassador to South Vietnam, Graham Martin, meets with South Vietnamese president and encourages him to resign. April 22nd, 1975, South Vietnamese president Thu resigns, taking his place was Vice President Tran Van Hung, also resigns on April 28, 1975. In other words, he won't there a week before he decided to run. And then General Duong Van Big Men, as everybody called him, becomes the president. So in a week there, they've had three presidents. April 23rd, 1975, at a speech in Tulane University, President Gerald Ford says that Vietnam War is finished as far as America is concerned. Today, Americans regain the sense of pride that existed before Vietnam, but it cannot be achieved by refighting a war. We could take pride into selling out the South Vietnamese. You can see there's Henry Kissinger. In the middle is Vice President Nelson Rockefeller and Gerald Ford. This was devastating news to South Vietnamese who were desperately pleading the United States support as the North Vietnamese surrounded Saigon for the final assault on the capital city, April 23rd, 1975. Okay. April 27th, 1975, the North Vietnamese had completely encircled Saigon and began to maneuver for the final assault. By the morning of April 30th, 1975, it was all over. As you can see, the Russian tanks breaking through the gates there at the presidential palace. Been there, seen the tank. When the North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon, the South Vietnamese surrendered and the Vietnam War was officially over, ? Okay. April 29th and 30th, 1975, the U.S. initiates Operation Frequent Wind, the final phase in the evacuation of American civilians and at-risk Vietnamese from Saigon. South Vietnam prior to take over the city by the North Vietnamese city. Operation Frequent Wind was carried out during the last days of the Vietnam War. More than 7,000 people were evacuated by helicopters from various points in Saigon. Now, as you can see the famous picture right there, and all the news media all over the world said, there's the Americans running away and escaping from the American embassy. Folks, I can tell you, I've seen it. The American embassy is no longer there. This building is still there. This was the CIA headquarters right next to the building. And part of the problem was Graham Martin waited until the last possible second to start getting the Americans out. And all the people who had worked, Vietnamese, who'd worked for us and South Vietnamese people, who he promised would get out. It was kind of like the Cooper Chase Amendment. We promised them we'd get them out, but, well, we just never kind of got around to getting all of them out. But that's the escape. April 30th, 1975, the headline says, the last few Americans still in South Vietnam were airlifted out of the country as Saigon fell to the communist fortress. North Vietnamese Colonel Bui Thien, accepting the surrender of South Vietnam later in the day, remarked, this is what he told the South Vietnamese people. You have nothing to fear between Vietnamese There are no victors and no vanquished. Only the Americans have been defeated. Oh, was that a lie? Okay. But it was not over. On April 30th, 1975, some South Vietnamese soldiers continued to fight. With the lack of ammunition, food, and medical care, they were forced to surrender. September 1976, Premier Phan Van Dong declared that his compatriots, North and South, were translating the revolutionary heroism they had displayed in fighting into creative labor in the acquisition of wealth and strength. In the South particularly, the old society was undergoing active changes as a result of stirring a revolutionary movement by the workers, peasants, youth, women, and intellectuals, and other groups. In agriculture alone, millions of people participated in bringing hundreds of thousands of more hectares under cultivation in the building of dredging thousands of kilometers of canals and ditches. See, what this is North Vietnam taking the South Vietnamese and putting them in re-education camps, which were really slave labor camps. This was how they were creatively acquiring new wealth by had a whole new group of people to get out there and work for nothing. Food, water, very little of that. This is the re-education camps. Let's talk a little bit about them. Re-education camp, the official title given to the prison camps operated by the North Vietnamese Communist government following the end of the Vietnam War. In such re-education camps, the government imprisoned several 100,000 former military officers and government workers from the former government of South Vietnam. Re-education, as it was implemented in Vietnam, was seen as both a means of revenge and a sophisticated technique of repression and indoctrination, which developed for several years in the North and was extended to the South following the 1975 fall of Saigon. You remember the guy a while ago said, hey, we're all Vietnamese, we're going to work together. How did that work? An estimated 1 to 2.5 million people were in prison with no formal charges or trials. According to published academic studies in the United States and Europe, 165,000 people died in Socialist Republic of Vietnam's re-education camp. Thousands were tortured or abused. Prisoners were incarcerated for as long as 17 years, with most terms ranging from 3 to 10 years. Now, we're talking about these people incarcerated for 17 years, slave labor, given a stick and said, go out and dig up those landmines by hand. If you blow up, that's okay. If you get sick, that's too bad because we've got somebody to replace you. Beatings, torture, okay? The North Vietnamese re-education camps executed thousands of its former opponents, consigned as many as 500,000 people to extended stays in the camps, subjected prisoners to intense political indoctrination, and forced them to write detailed confessions of their supposed crimes. Some inmates said they were forced to betray other prisoners for imaginary crimes in order to prove their own sincerity. Lists of torture techniques including ripping out fingernails with pliers, whipping prisoners with live electric wires, hanging inmates from the ceiling and beating them, and forcing prisoners to drink water and then jumping on their bloated stomachs. Disciplined prisoners by locking them in metal storage boxes called connexes, where the temperature was often stored at 120 degrees. Water was sometimes denied as punishment, and some former prisoners said they drank their own urine. Others reported that some prisoners were chained so long that maggots grew in the wounds on their wrists and ankles. Forced inmates to perform hard labor by providing only the most rudimentary food and medical care. Many prisoners starved to death while others were left to die a lingering painful death from disease. Our Congress had a lot to do with this. But you remember the North Vietnamese guy who took over Saigon says that, hey, we're all Vietnamese, we're going to work together for a better Vietnam. The only way for them to be released was after all the torture. As a condition of release, prisoners had to promise never to reveal the cruel actions forced upon them. In other words, we did it, but you can't tell anybody about it and we'll let you go. Nonetheless, after years of the release or escape, they finally shared their horror stories. And this is what some of them had to say. The communists did not want us to re-educate us. They wanted vengeance. The communists practiced a form of genocide. They would beat a prisoner at night. They made noise to keep us awake so they couldn't sleep. We all knew they could come for us at any time. Our sleep was always uneasy. As a young little boy there with a suitcase. The re-education period. Most of the re-education camps were operated until 1986 when Nguyen Van Linh became the General Secretary of the Communist Party. He began to close the harsher camps and reform the others. 2 years later, Washington and Hanoi reached an agreement that Vietnam would free all of its former soldiers and officials of the old regime who were still held in re-education camps across the country and allow them to immigrate to the United States under the Orderly Departure Program. As of August 1995, around 405 Vietnamese prisoners and their families were resettled in the U.S. Now, has the war ended yet? May 12, 1975, the U.S. merchant ship Marquez is captured with 39 sailors on board in the Gulf of Siam by Cambodian communists. So we were fighting in Cambodia at the same time. We're in Vietnam. President Gerald Ford sends in the U.S. Marines too late to stop the battle, but when the first shot was fired, the communists released the hostages. But you can't go, whoops, time out, we got to end. And so the battle cost the lives of 38 Marines while they were just trying to get out. There were 3 Marines stranded on the island of Koh Tong. They were later captured by the Cambodians and executed. Their fellow U.S. Marines were not allowed to return to rescue them. If you'd like more information about the Marquez attack, go back and see some of the shows where we talk about Joseph Hargrove, one of the Marines, 3 Marines left from Mount Olive, North Carolina, and his cousin Kerry Turner, who has been back to the island investigating his nephew's murder there and all the information. But these guys were called deserters for a long time. So when did the war actually end? January 21st, 1977, the day after President Carter was inaugurated, he pardoned most of the 10,000 Vietnam War draft evaders. See, Gerald Ford came in and put some criteria to it. He came in and just said, everybody's free. They can go do what they want to. Don't worry about it. We're going to forgive you. I'm glad he can, because I still have problems with that. But Carter pardons draft evaders, orders a study of deserters. He's going to study deserters. And veterans protest, others split. Okay. March 13th, 1982, the Vietnam Memorial, the wall was unveiled in Washington, D.C. July 11th, 1995, the United States established a diplomatic relations with Vietnam. May 14th, 1996, President Bill Clinton signs an order terminating the designation of Vietnam as a combat zone. Listen, we left there in 1973. It only took them 23 years to say the war was over. Okay, Now, those of you out there, if you're anywhere in the Triangle area, I invite you to this event. It's a town hall meeting for the aging veterans, what they need to know in planning for their future. It's being sponsored by the Vietnam Veterans of America and Vietnam Veterans of America, Chapter 530 in Durham. It's Friday, November 22nd. It's at the Veterans of Foreign Wars Post 2740 and 3707 Dearborn Drive, Durham. Registration from 8:30 to 9:30. We're going to try to tell you if you're an aging veteran, which I know everybody is, one flavor or the other, a family of an aging veteran or a caregiver of an aging veteran. We're going to try to tell you everything that you need to know as far as getting benefits and anything else you need to know is to take care of the veteran. Burial benefits, TRICARE, a little bit of everything. If you have any questions whatsoever about the event, we'd love to have you come in. We hope to have a good crowd there. You can call me at 919-434-7345 or dixonbill80@yahoo.com. Thank you as always for watching the show. Hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope we dispelled some myths and so forth. Please share it with your friends. We're out here. Our next show will be November 27th, which is the day before Thanksgiving. So we'll be here to after you've eaten your, we're going to be on the show, then you eat Thanksgiving. I get that right. So then you can go feed yourself up with Thanksgiving and so forth. One more thing. I know we're running a little bit over, but I was talking to a friend Saturday. He was looking up some information about Bat 21, the movie, which sucked. It was a good movie, it just didn't tell the truth. He was looking for Bat 21 information and looked whatever he looked up as our show came up. So if you want to know the truth about Bat 21, go watch our show. Thank you very much. And if you're veterans out there serving in Vietnam or any place, thank you for your sacrifice. And M9, we're through.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Telestream's Wirecast software, StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and DeltaForce.net.